Welcome back to It's Not Normal, the podcast, episode 42. In this week's episode, I'm going to be doing a recap of Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents, chapters 6 through 10. I just finished this book this week, and it's taken me some time to get through. I think this was one of those reads that was validating and eye-opening, but also very heavy. I think it prompted some serious self-reflection, and there were certain ideas that were introduced throughout this book that made me really want to sit with them and to dive deeper into them personally. And so there would be times when I would sit down and tackle an entire chapter in one sitting, and other times when I would just read a section at a time and then not pick the book back up for a week or two. So if you are reading this book currently, take it at your own pace because there's a lot of information to absorb here. But I'm really looking forward to sharing my insights of chapters 6 through 10, the second half of this book, with all of you. So let's get into it. Chapter 6 is titled, What It's Like to Be an Internalizer. And I want to start off this section of the recap with a quote from this chapter that really sort of encapsulates the feeling that this chapter gave me. It stood out to me, and so I want to share it with you. Emotional neglect can make premature independence feel like a virtue. Many people who were neglected as children don't realize that their independence was a necessity, not a choice. And so we're going to get into this a bit more as we move throughout this recap, but this, I think, kind of sets the tone for this chapter. And so I want to briefly mention the difference between internalizers and externalizers. Internalizers notice everything. They believe that they can make things better by trying harder, and they tend to try to solve problems from the inside out. Whereas externalizers are extremely reactive, they're quick to place blame, and they believe that something needs to change in the outside world in order for them to feel better. As an internalizer myself, it can sometimes feel like my brain absorbs everything, whether I want it to or not. And that isn't necessarily a result of being raised in a toxic environment. Sometimes, whether or not a person is an internalizer or an externalizer is simply the way that their nervous system is wired and has been wired from the day that they were born. But I think the reason that it's important to focus on internalizers specifically is because a lot of the characteristics that we embody are sort of gateways for things like hypervigilance, parentification, people-pleasing, self-neglect, and self-doubt. Internalizers tend to be highly perceptive and very emotional. We're very aware of what's going on. We're very absorbent. And so we long for genuine emotional intimacy, which for those of us who were raised by emotionally immature, or as Lindsay Gibson sometimes refers to them as emotionally phobic parents, and experienced things like stonewalling and the silent treatment, it can make childhood an intensely lonely experience where you feel this emptiness, but you don't necessarily know where it's coming from or what to call it. More often than not, internalizers come to believe that the cost of connection is to put other people first and to treat them as more important. If you are an internalizer, you might have memories from throughout your childhood of always being the happy one, of always trying to bring your family together and to be cheerful. If it was around the holidays, maybe encouraging your family to come together and to all set up the decorations or to sit down and share a meal together. You were always kind of trying to bring some positivity to the family dynamic, to lighten the mood and to brighten everyone's spirits, despite how you might be feeling personally. And I think that that is such a key characteristic of internalizers, feeling like if we work harder, if we do something better, we can solve these external problems. That it sort of starts within us and we have this power or influence to change the course of things. But in truth, no one person has that power to completely shift a family dynamic. As internalizers, I think we tend to downplay our true emotions, especially if they are sadness, anger, grief, resentment. And I think it's common for us to feel apologetic or embarrassed even when we do seek help and when we do share how we're truly feeling, because we feel like so many people have it so much worse than we do. Who are we to be complaining about anything? And I think that this is a narrative that's commonly reinforced by emotionally immature parents, even in comparing their upbringing to your own, to invalidate your emotions or to downplay the severity of the toxic behavior that you're enduring. And so as we get older and we move into adulthood, as we gain perspective and start to find ourselves in relationships with emotionally mature people, internalizers can feel surprised to have our emotions, our feelings taken seriously, and to be met with curiosity, understanding, empathy, like your emotions and feelings hold just as much weight as anyone else's. Because I think for so many of us, that is such an unfamiliar experience. Throughout childhood, our parents' wants, needs, and interests, their desires, all took precedence over our own. I think so many of us were made to feel secondary for so long that to have our thoughts and feelings and emotions validated, to feel like they actually carry some weight, is unfamiliar, but a welcome change. Something else that Lindsay Gibson talked about in this chapter that I thought was really interesting and worth mentioning was this idea that we can be calmed by proximity and engagement. Imagine this sort of herd mentality. If you've got a lone buffalo facing a lion, there's fear, there's danger, there's a very real threat that they're facing. Now imagine that this buffalo is surrounded by 100 of its own kind. The threat doesn't go away, but there's a sense of calm that comes along with being in close proximity to your own, feeling like you can sort of face this threat together. There's power in numbers, there's reassurance. And when I read that, I couldn't help but think of the times throughout my childhood that following a really stressful experience, an hours-long argument or confrontation that as a child can feel so overwhelming and scary, what would happen afterwards? Was there eye contact? Was there physical closeness? These different behaviors that can really calm us in the presence of stress or danger. And I think for a lot of us who were raised by emotionally immature parents, what we get following an experience like this is absence, is disconnection and distance. And so we're left to kind of face this threat and this danger, this stress on our own, which as a child can be so challenging because we haven't yet developed the emotional maturity to really understand and process and move through these different emotions and experiences. And so emotional neglect, I think, is one of those things that can be sort of silent and invisible for internalizers. We don't see abuse for what it is because we're convinced that there's something that we could be doing better that would make the situation as a whole better. If we try harder, if we do something differently, then we might be able to turn things around. But in truth, when we're dealing with emotionally immature parents, the problems lay outside of us, as do the solutions. And that can be a really challenging thing to learn, especially throughout childhood. The next chapter, chapter 7, is called Breaking Down and Awakening. And this chapter came to me at a really perfect time. I have never felt so in touch with myself, so grounded and confident in the person that I am. And there have been a handful of experiences over the course of the last month or so when I found myself not catering to one particular person or group dynamic, but feeling really comfortable in who I am and saying the things that come to mind without overthinking. And so getting into this chapter was really validating for me. And what's so interesting and wonderful about the way that Lindsay Gibson approaches this is that she sort of talks about a breakdown in a positive way. And I want to start off by, again, sort of sharing with you a quote that embodies the overall tone of this chapter for me. When you're going through a breakdown, what's typically happening is that our struggle to deny our emotional truth is breaking down. Emotional distress is a signal that it's getting harder to remain emotionally unconscious. I think socially, the term breakdown or the phrase having a breakdown has such a negative connotation. It seems like a bad thing, like there's so much going on that you can't handle it. It almost makes you feel weak. But if what's breaking down is a past version of ourselves that no longer serves us, that has distanced itself from our true selves, then there's nothing negative about that. It's a positive thing. I think so many of us can find ourselves in this position at one time or another throughout our lives, where we feel like we're on the brink of breaking down. We are on the brink of some sort of substantial change. And for those of us who were raised by emotionally immature parents, I think the root of this breakdown can be in how easy it is to continue to play the roles that we played throughout childhood in our adult lives, because those are what feel safe and familiar. That is how we have learned to be loved and accepted by others. And so we sort of seamlessly integrate all of these different characteristics and behaviors and self-defense and self-protection mechanisms that we have adapted into our adult lives and into our adult friendships and relationships. And so the only way for you to kind of break down so that you can allow space for a more authentic version of yourself is to become conscious of all of the different storylines that you have been living by. And I think this tends to happen when the pain and overwhelm and dysregulation from adhering to roles and fantasies and old family patterns begin to outweigh the potential benefits. And again, what's so wonderful about the way that Lindsay Gibson presents this idea is that it's when we find ourselves in this position that we are about to discover our true self. And so as daunting as a breakdown might seem or feel or sound, in some ways it can be something to be really excited about. And so that brings to the surface this idea of our true self. Who is our true self? What does our true self want? This chapter talks about how our true self wants to grow and to be known, to feel comfortable and safe expressing itself. And I think more than anything, our true self wants us to accept its guidance and its legitimate desires, the things that it truly wants. I think it's kind of one of those situations where your body is telling you something. Your true self is sort of home to your gut instincts and your reactions. These are the things that we should listen to, that we should trust. And yet being raised in a toxic environment can sometimes distance us from those things because we don't trust our instincts. We're sort of encouraged to cast aside the things that feel natural to us if they don't serve our parents. And so it can be incredibly difficult not only to listen to our true selves, but to hear them in the first place. And so you may not be aware of the existence of your true self, and you might be living a life that is not authentic to you, that is not sustainable for you. And there may come a point when your body starts to tell you that something is wrong, that you need to listen to yourself, and that if you're not going to do anything about it, then your body will. It will make you listen. And I think that is kind of when you approach this point of breaking down. And what happens when we break down and we let go of this past version of ourselves is that we make space for a newer, more authentic version of ourselves. We can be awakened to new parts of us and to different parts of our personality and our identity that serve us better, that are much healthier and much more in line with the person that we truly are. And when you start to lean into that, you may start to focus more on solutions than problems. You might feel more capable of handling and understanding negative emotions, which means that you have massive potential for growth and development. And so you might find yourself prioritizing things like self-care. You might start to realize that not every problem is yours to fix. You might stop idealizing your parents and viewing them as these fantasy characters that they want to be viewed as. You might start to see unhealthy, one-sided relationships start to fall away. I think, going back to the idea of being an internalizer, you often find yourself in relationships in the position of the giver, where you're consistently overextending yourself and you always feel like you are doing more. You are putting more time, energy, and effort into the relationship than the other person because you've been conditioned to believe that that is the only way to make connection. And so as you start to discover your true self and embody those characteristics, you might start to see some of those unhealthy, one-sided relationships fall away. And this is something that we've talked about in the past, that as you heal, as you start to discover yourself and understand and set boundaries, your circle may become smaller, which can be sad. It can be a challenging thing to reconcile, but it's better to surround yourself with emotionally mature people than emotionally immature people. And lastly, one of the things that Lindsay Gibson talks about when you start to feel more aligned with your true self is that you start to focus more on your strengths and your positive qualities. And this was a really interesting one for me because I think it's common for children who were raised by emotionally immature parents to fear coming across as arrogant. I think confidence can sometimes be confused with arrogance. I think emotionally immature parents and narcissistic parents alike are so skilled in remaining at the center of attention and shifting the focus onto them anytime it's on another person. And they encourage feelings of self-doubt, self-neglect, and uncertainty because it keeps them at the center of your universe. And for me, I remember over the course of the last year or so, there have been a number of times where I found myself saying, I'm proud of myself for doing this, and recognizing the positive qualities of mine and offering myself reassurance and compassion in the same way that I would for another person in my life that I care about. And yet when you're raised in that kind of environment, it can feel like that's the wrong thing to do. Like you shouldn't give yourself too much credit. You shouldn't pat yourself on the back. Like humility is important above all other things. But I think the humility that an emotionally immature parent will encourage is not healthy humility. And so now, as we've kind of gone through this process of breaking down and becoming more emotionally conscious, we're able to start to live a life that is much more true to who we are, that is much more sustainable. And we find ourselves feeling confident and feeling grounded and being more selective about the people that we allow into our inner circle and setting and maintaining boundaries, not only personally, but also within friendships and relationships. We have a certain standard for how we will allow ourselves to be treated. And it's a really wonderful thing when we start to look at ourselves as individuals who are deserving of love and compassion and kindness, and even more when we start to allow ourselves to give those things to ourselves. In this chapter, Lindsay Gibson introduces the idea that what has happened to people matters less than whether they've processed what has happened to them. And I thought it was such a clear and concise way to describe the difference between cycle breakers and their parents. I think children of emotionally immature parents oftentimes hold a lot of compassion for their parents. I know personally, I have no ill will toward my parents. I love them and care about them and would love for them to process what has happened to them because I understand that a lot of their unhealthy behavior most likely stems from their own unresolved trauma. And the difference is that I have made a concerted effort to learn how to process the things that I have experienced in my life, my own trauma, and to move towards that discomfort so that I can have a better understanding of myself, of healthy relationship dynamics, and I can treat myself and the people in my life with empathy and compassion. This chapter kind of closes off by talking about how we can now choose a new set of values to live by as we've sort of broken down this old version of ourselves and we've become more emotionally mature and self-aware, and we can implement these new values in our life moving forward. I've talked a lot about the concepts that are discussed in Chapter 8, both in podcast episodes and online, and so I don't want to repeat myself too much, so I'm going to skip ahead to Chapter 9, which is titled, How It Feels to Live Free of Roles and Fantasies. And this is such a great follow-up for what we just talked about, this sort of awakening that we experience after we've broken down this old version of ourselves. We start to experience life in a much more authentic way, and to live free of the roles that we once fulfilled for our parents or our families as a whole. And before we get into what that feels like, I think it's important to just briefly touch on some of the family dynamics that can keep us trapped in these old ways of life, in these old roles. And the first one that Lindsay Gibson mentions is the discouragement of individuality. I think for emotionally immature parents, individuality and leaning into our personality, discovering our identity, can stir feelings of rejection and abandonment in an emotionally immature parent. And so they will either consciously or subconsciously create these highly enmeshed families so that they don't have to sit with or reconcile these fears and anxieties that come up when they're faced with their child's individuality. The next is the denial of individual needs and desires. This isn't a new concept. When you're raised by emotionally immature parents, their wants and needs take precedence over your own. We are taught throughout childhood, we're sort of conditioned to believe that goodness means being as self-effacing as possible so that our parents' needs are met first. And I have to be honest, when I first read that, I wasn't entirely certain of the definition of effacing. And when I looked it up, it means to erase. And that was so devastating to read, I think, because of how true it felt. I remember when I was younger, I had a crush on a boy when I was 8 or 9, and it was so innocent. But when my parents found out about it, they told me, "You can't like this boy. You are not allowed to like boys." And I remember feeling sad and confused. And from that point on, like, I wasn't free to express myself, no matter how normal or natural a feeling felt. I felt like I had to hide and suppress, maybe even feel ashamed of these different parts of myself. And it was so challenging as a child to constantly weigh my emotions and how I was feeling. Was this the right thing or was this the wrong thing? Is this healthy or is this unhealthy? And to navigate that and to answer all of those questions without being able to go to my parents for guidance or advice or help. And there were so many experiences like that throughout my childhood, and I'm sure throughout a lot of yours as well, where these things that are completely normal and natural for children to experience, when they make their way to the surface and you express them and you're met with disappointment or punishment or shame, you start to feel inclined to hide these parts of yourself and essentially erase part of who you are. And once you understand that the way to earn your parents' favor is to only show them the sides of you that are beneficial to them, that they approve of, these other parts of yourself might never make their way to the surface. They might never see the light of day. And so you do start to erase part of who you are because you're never allowed to explore these parts. And lastly, there's adhering to an internalized parental voice, basically living by your parents' standards rather than your own. And this is something that I carried with me for a long time. And I still at times hear my parents' voice in my head, and I don't base my decisions off of that any longer, but I definitely do still think about it, which can at times make me feel bad or judged. But for a long time, I based my decisions solely on what I thought my parents wanted me to do, what would make them happy. What I wanted was entirely secondary. And I thought that that was completely normal. I thought that I was being a good kid by doing that, by always putting my parents first, even in making decisions in my own life that directly affected me. And honestly, it wasn't until I was 21 that I realized what a waste of time that was. Because I was in my first ever serious relationship. I was 21 years old, and I was asking for just a little bit of freedom. Freedom that I thought I earned, that I deserved, for always putting my parents first, for always doing the right thing, excelling in school, never getting in trouble. I thought that I earned their respect. I thought I earned just a little bit of freedom. And I was told that being a great kid throughout my childhood didn't earn me any points. They don't carry over. It's not like a resume. And that was a really eye-opening conversation for me to have with my parent. And that was one of the hardest things for me to reconcile as I started to heal. The amount of time that I spent putting my parents first and prioritizing their wants and needs over my own, sort of voluntarily missing out on some experiences that if I could go back, I would have loved to have been a part of. That, I think, for me was a catalyst to start listening to my own internal voice rather than that of my parent. And so once you're able to break free of these outdated family patterns, which obviously first comes with recognition, you start to feel, I know I have, like it's okay to be human. It's okay to be imperfect. Being raised in a toxic environment can condition you to put perfectionism and efficiency before feeling and judgment before compassion. But now you can start to achieve balance. You develop mental flexibility, which I think is a sign of emotional maturity. Whereas emotionally immature parents tend to be emotionally more rigid. I think they are black and white thinkers. And now we can start to see the gray area and understand that things happen, life changes, you make mistakes, things don't always go to plan, and that's okay. For me, achieving this balance has been truly life-changing. I feel like I now take my feelings into consideration just as much as I take others' feelings into consideration. I no longer feel guilty for having downtime because I understand that I don't have to constantly be producing to be of value. I understand that I inherently have value as a person for who I am, not just what I do. I allow myself to set boundaries and limits and to say no when I feel like it's necessary without feeling guilty. And I've developed an openness to change. I think I have done a lot of work personally to start to be able to welcome change into my life and to no longer view it as this unpredictable, big, scary thing. And that flexibility, that balance has allowed me to feel much more in line with my true self. And I feel really thankful for that. And lastly, chapter 10. This is the last chapter of the book, and it's titled How to Identify Emotionally Mature People. And Lindsay Gibson starts off this chapter by talking about the lore of old patterns, how when you're raised by an emotionally immature parent, it can be common to find yourself in friendships or relationships with an emotionally immature person. Those characteristics and behaviors feel familiar, and so you might gravitate towards them. And something that I wanted to mention is sort of the flip side of this, is how when you're raised in a toxic environment and you've realized your trauma, you might have developed, whether consciously or unconsciously, this defense, this sort of self-protection, where you start to view life through a trauma lens. And you might start to assign manipulative traits and characteristics to people who aren't actually manipulating you. They might have a similarity with a parent or partner who has abused you in the past, and so you might connect dots that in truth shouldn't be connected. And I wanted to touch on this because I think it's a very real, valid experience, and it can be so challenging to let your guard down and to allow yourself to be open to healthy relationships. And the only way that we can do that is to remain objective and to not allow ourselves to see things that aren't truly there. And so this chapter goes on to discuss characteristics that you'll find in emotionally mature people. And the first one is being realistic. I think emotionally immature parents tend to be externalizers, where they are very reactive, they place blame on other people, sort of external circumstances, and they expect reality to sort of bend to their will. Emotionally mature people tend to work with reality and to understand that sometimes things don't go their way and plans change. They are realistic in their expectations and in the way that they move through life. The next is reliable. I was having a conversation the other day about growing up in a toxic environment, and I was asked, what was the hardest part? What was the worst of it? And one of the first things that came to mind was the intense unpredictability. You could say or do the same thing, but depending on the day, the time, and the mood, you might get a drastically different reaction. And that, I think, is a sign of emotional immaturity. But when you're dealing with an emotionally mature person, they tend to have a similar temperament regardless of the situation that they find themselves in, which is so calming and reassuring to be around. Emotionally mature people are respectful. They recognize and admire your individuality, whereas emotionally immature people might view it as a threat. They're reciprocal. Emotionally mature people want to compromise. Compromise can be a satisfying experience when you're dealing with an emotionally mature person. They have a willingness and want to put the same amount of time, energy, and effort into maintaining a healthy relationship as you do, which is so refreshing to no longer feel like the relationship is one-sided, and they're responsive. Emotionally mature people want to apologize and make amends. I think when you're dealing with an emotionally immature parent, it's common for them to get defensive in light of any controversy, and their apologies tend to feel empty because they're not followed by any action. Whereas when you're dealing with an emotionally mature person, their actions will reflect their intent to make amends. They recognize how their words or actions might have negatively impacted you, and if they truly care for you, they will make an effort to remember that and for their actions to reflect that. There's a quote in this chapter that really sums this up that I want to share with you, and it says, "Empathy is what makes people feel safe in relationships. Along with self-awareness, it's the soul of emotional intelligence." And I think empathy is something that I have experienced after moving out of my parents' house and developing friendships and relationships with emotionally mature people. And I think realizing my own trauma has allowed me to have more empathy than I ever have for other people, both people that I know personally and complete strangers, because I understand what it's like to go through something challenging and to be dealing with all of these things that on the surface are invisible. Surrounding yourself with people who share that understanding is really wonderful. I was writing in my journal the other day about getting to know myself, discovering different parts of myself as an adult, because I think, one of the most challenging things to reconcile as a child who was raised in an unhealthy environment and was so self-sacrificing for so long can be the amount of time that you spent not knowing your true self, not allowing your true self to be seen or to be heard because it wasn't safe. And now that I've started to reconnect with my true self. And I've experienced these feelings of confidence and validation and joy. It can sometimes make me feel like I wish I got to experience these things sooner. I wish I got to know my true self throughout my life at all of these different times so that I can have these memories, so that I could have shown up for these friendships in a certain way and had these different experiences. But I started to realize that it's kind of cool in a way to get to know ourselves as adults because we know more. We can be more intentional with the decisions that we make. We can make more informed decisions about the person that we are and the kind of life that we want to live. And we might have more capability to actually put those things into practice as adults as opposed to children. And as I finished this book, Lindsay Gibson reiterated that idea. She said, "To be aware and present at the birth of your new self as an adult is pretty incredible stuff. How many people get to be awake and aware for the emergence of the person they were always meant to be? How many people get to have 2 lifetimes in one?" And to end off this book that has provided so much insight about not only my life personally, but also my family, my relationship with my parents, and why they are the way they are, how their behavior has impacted me. To end this off on such a positive, uplifting note, I thought was really wonderful. And it's true. I think we are able now to get to know ourselves as adults. We have lived a life and we get to start to live a new life now and to choose the direction that it goes in. And I think having experienced emotional abuse and manipulation and suppressing these really wonderful sides of ourselves that are now re-emerging, we might even have a greater appreciation for ourselves, for the people around us, and for life in general than if we hadn't experienced any of that in the first place. And so with that, I think I'm going to be wrapping up this week's episode of the podcast. This is the conclusion of season 2 of It's Not Normal. I'm going to be taking a quick 2-week break, and then we will be back for season 3. I have to say that these feelings of productionism and self-worth are definitely creeping in the back of my brain. I feel like if I am not working and producing, then I don't have any value. And while I know that that's not true, it is scary and uncomfortable to sit with. And we've been shooting this podcast for 42 weeks, and so as much as I know that this break is well earned and much needed, I think it also serves as a practice for me to kind of sit with this discomfort and face that fear of mine. So if you enjoyed this week's episode, please be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. If you're listening on Spotify, please be sure to leave us a rating. I will be back in 2 weeks with another episode of It's Not Normal, the podcast.